Today I'm going to focus on a few things, but these are the four kind of key areas that I'd like to touch on today. The first is the new ecosystem. So the journalism world that we're living in now is different from the one that you were all born into, that I was born into, and that we were living in even 10, 15 years ago. So I just want to share my own thoughts on what that ecosystem looks like, because that sets the stage for our own journalism ventures and our own journalism entrepreneurship. We're working within a context of an ecosystem, and this is a global ecosystem, and each ecosystem is different country by country, region by region. But overall, there's changes in the journalism world overall that affect all of those ecosystems. I want to share some thoughts on new products, new kinds of forms of journalism that are shaping what we're doing and giving us new opportunities, new business models. So how can we actually sustain ourselves, make money, and make these journalism projects sustainable? Sometimes when there's something that comes up, the question is most relevant at that moment, as opposed to, an hour later. So feel free to interject with a question in the chat, or even to unmute if you'd like to do that, if that's easier for you or more comfortable. Any questions up till now? Anything I've said thus far? Raja mentioned I'm focused on family. Yes, that is my primary focus in life, is being a good father. I think we all have our professions, we all have our careers, we all have a lot that we end up doing, but ultimately our primary loyalty is to those who are close to us, and as parents, that's our primary responsibility. Okay, so I'm going to focus on journalism disruption. And it's no surprise to all of you that journalism has been massively disrupted, right? The industry is undergoing massive change. And what I'm going to share with you is some of the challenges we're facing first off, and then I'm going to focus on how these challenges and how this disruption opens up an amazing array of new opportunities. And you all know this because you're taking advantage of it. And I'm going to share how I look at it, and I'd be happy to hear how you see it. So first of all, the coronavirus in particular added insult to injury. We were already facing a dramatic set of changes in the business models, distribution models, technology, interruption, and a whole range of intermediation from social media platforms, for example. So we had a whole range of different complexities that we were already facing in the journalism arena. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, right, the Black Swan event, this dramatic event that none of us, I think, anticipated, the coronavirus epidemic, and that, as I said, added insult to injury, made it even more difficult for particularly local news creators and distributors to survive, for a variety of reasons I won't get into in depth. But it basically has a lot to do with the advertising world, right? So initially, this is a stat from early on. Basically, this is early on, just noting the dramatic effect this had, right? And this is a stat that just illustrates how dramatically the reaction hit the world of journalism in particular, right? When companies were cost cutting, one of the first things they could do was cut discretionary budgets, and discretionary budgets largely included their advertising campaigns in sort of general media. So this was early in the pandemic from the Wall Street Journal. This stat, it's about a year ago, a little over a year ago, and gradually, things stabilized a little bit. This is Financial Times stat from a little bit later on. The newspaper industry specifically was dramatically impacted, right? And again, this is in a period where we already had dramatic challenges being faced, right, by news organizations, not just in the U.S., not just in Europe, throughout Asia, throughout Latin America, all over the world. So this period created an even further damage and danger for news organizations, and the limited budgets they had for experimentation, for our research and development, were cut even further. And while that was happening, the share of digital ad revenue in the U.S., and actually this is true largely around the world as well, was continuing to flow more towards the FANG companies, right? Facebook, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, etc. And the leftovers were sliced even more narrowly, right? So the little bit of remnants in terms of ad spending was getting chopped up into smaller and smaller pieces in the competitive environment of the existing news ecosystem. Are no longer relying on the newspaper around the world, right? There's lots of stats. I won't get too deep into this today because that's a subject for another day, and I think all of you are familiar with these kinds of broad changes that are happening around the world. But essentially, people are no longer, sitting in front of their newspapers day after day, right? That's a declining behavior. It's still behavior among some portions of the population. It will be for some time to come, but it's a declining number, right? That's just not the typical behavior. When I talk to students around the world, even journalism students, that's just not how they start their day. It's not how they access news. It's just not a behavior that's going to continue to thrive in the long run. In addition, we've seen massive consolidation. I think this has happened to some extent in Pakistan. It's happened in India. It's happened in various Latin American countries. It's happening in the US significantly. So we face a lot of these challenges. And that's the context for the conversation. So we have the pandemic impacts just spoken about. We have consolidation of the industry, so fewer owners exerting more control, declining revenue, largely ad revenue in particular, but subscription revenue is also declining, although digital subscriptions in some cases are rising, which is a good thing. We have declining trust. Again, that's a separate issue, which I won't speak a lot about today, but increasingly people are skeptical of mainstream news outlets. They attribute motives to news organizations. There are all kinds of disinformation campaigns that threaten people's trust of news organizations. Many journalists, as you all know well, have been threatened physically, coerced, or censored by media organizations, by government organizations around the world. I had a student from Zaman Media in Turkey who essentially their office was essentially shut down and he could no longer work as an independent journalist. And that's happened. I had a student from Venezuela, also had to work on a WhatsApp kind of news delivery system because of massive government censorship and threats in her home of Venezuela. I've had a student from China who wanted to write about LGBT issues and faced massive threats and really couldn't do the journalism she wanted to do freely. So we have a lot of constraints and challenges that face journalists. And yet, in this last point here, we see declining barriers to entry. And that's fancy economic jargon that basically means anyone can now start anything. And that's a dramatically different reality than the one we had just a couple of decades ago. And that's essentially what I want to focus on today, is the fact that we can actually build whatever we want to. There's incredible freedom and power that you have as an individual now to create things and distribute things to people locally, to people regionally, to people nationally, to people internationally. And that can happen in any number of formats, right? Anyone can reach virtually anyone in the world via email, through newsletters. They can reach people through audio via podcasting apps. They can reach people through text by creating free publications online or paid publications online, membership organizations online. The barriers to entry, the difficulties that people used to face in creating something are just simply not there in the same way they were. Now, that's not to say that everything is easy or that there are no challenges. There certainly are. But it's to say that the challenges are much different challenges. They're not technical challenges, right? You don't need any money or any specific technical skill to create a publication that can reach people all over the world. You need another set of skills. You need to create something of quality and value that actually fulfills a need. But there's no technical barrier as there was when you needed to buy a printing press, right? Or when you needed to have massive distribution capabilities and you needed a lot of access to capital. That's just not true anymore. So those barriers are gone, and anyone with a camera or anyone with a phone, right? Anyone with a digital device of any kind can now reach anybody. Imagination you have, the discipline you have, the persistence you have, the motivation you have to solve an actual problem, to address a real need of real people in the real world, that's the limiting factor, right? You have to identify something that people in the real world actually need and want. And if you do that, and you have a thoughtful approach to actually reaching people, and you learn lessons of what people have done around the world, anyone can do this. And you are all in an excellent position to do this very well and to thrive and to succeed. Let me pose a question to you. I wanted to use the Slido software. So let's try that one more time. I only got 5 responses from that first question, but I want to try this again because this is, again, my style is to engage with you all. So I want to ask you a question, which is about a niche news product or service that's been of interest to you and why. Okay, so I'm going to paste the link in here again, and let's see if we can get a little bit of response. If not, then we'll try a different approach, but I'm going to try one more time. So there's a link in here, and if you click that link, you'll see a question on your screen, right? And it's anonymous, so there's no there's no personalized, I'm not judging anyone. I'm just curious, what news products, specifically kind of niche news product, of interest to you, and why? Why is that new thing of interest to you? So maybe there's a new newsletter, maybe there's a new podcast, a new local website, a new niche website, some other kind of news product on could be something on YouTube. It could be really anything. It could be a WhatsApp group. It could be really anything that's been of interest to you, useful to you. Just you could say what it is, and more importantly is why. What about it was interesting? And I'll give you a moment to think about that. Okay, I see a few responses already. I'll give you some more time. And if you could just put in a phrase about why does this thing interest you? What's new about it? What's interesting? What's novel? What attracted you? And then after I give you a chance to respond, I'll share a couple of my own. Okay, so you can see some of the responses here, right? So Twitter, absolutely. So the social platforms are a great way for us to keep up with a curated stream of information. That's social curation, right? We choose who to follow, as opposed to relying on a particular news editor to exert judgment. We kind of have some say. And someone else below this, let me scroll down here a little bit. Someone else mentioned a few others: local news, environmental news, modern love podcasts, eBaum's World, BuzzFeed. So lots of other kinds of different things. Someone is interested in providing financial news, which is another area of interest. I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with this one. Lad Bible. I'm not sure what that is. Vice News, the information. So these are all kinds of publications that are essentially filling a niche, right? The information provides technology news, right? There's plenty of free technology news. The information has quality reporting on stories that really aren't addressed elsewhere. So they're filling an important gap. And Vice News is presenting news in an authentic way, right? It feels more real, at least to some people, than a traditional kind of news broadcast approach. And instead of having the stiff, artificial person kind of reading in a somewhat fake voice, right, about a place that they may have never been, right? At least historically, a lot of news organizations would drop broadcasters in. They called it parachuting in, and they just sort of read off a teleprompter, and they have no idea really what's going on, and they've not spent time there in some cases. Vice takes a different approach. At least that's their claim. So in all these cases, people are breaking with tradition in some way. They're disrupting an existing approach, and it's creating what I think of as a new ecosystem. One is the Week magazine. So it's a curated publication that grabs news from all over the world, and it provides capsule summaries of key issues from different countries, from different political perspectives, different topics, in a concise, quickly readable way that's very carefully edited and curated. And it is a kind of way to keep in touch with news from around the world, around our country, US, and around the world, and also a variety of topics that I might not have otherwise have time to read on a particular week. And it does so in paper form. So I can certainly do that online in many ways, but sometimes I like to get away from the screen. Right? I don't know about all of you, but I have to spend a lot of time these days on the screen. And so I sometimes like that paper, and I trust their curation. So that's one. And they have a version for kids. So my daughters now are enjoying the kids version, which is delightful for them to access information from around the world in a kid's voice. Second is The Economist, because there's still value in high quality news and analysis that's done in depth. Instead of just telling us what happened yesterday, it tells us what happens every day. So it's talking about changes that are going to affect different industries over a long period of time with deep analysis, and not in a quick, 40-word capsule, but actually in depth and with some subtlety and with an international perspective. A lot of the US news is written from a US perspective. This is a little bit more of an international perspective. And it's done with great quality writing and great quality editing. The third would be a podcast. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I consume a lot of newsletters at the moment, because I find that you get an individual voice, a strong voice, as opposed to an organizational voice, an individual voice. And one is the Hidden Brain podcast, as an example. And this is a particular topic. It's not really news, it's more feature driven, but it's about how we think, how our minds work, and how the issues of the day are affected by psychological factors. And the host is fantastic. It's very well researched, it's very well thought out, it's very well edited, and there are fantastic guests, so you get experts and perspectives, and it's done in a way that provides information without being didactic. So it's based on stories, and it's based on real world cases of things that are happening. So those are examples, and any number of newsletters across a range of topics, because newsletters allow me to access news in my inbox, right? We're in our inbox. I don't know about you, but I'm in my inbox every day. That's the one place I definitely go every day. I may not go to certain websites every day, but I definitely go to my inbox every day. So that's the most convenient place for me to do reading when I'm digital, in a digital mode. So anyway, that's a little bit from me. Yes, and Bush mentions I miss holding books and newspapers. I absolutely am with you. I totally wholeheartedly agree with you on that. I do resort to this Kindle device because it has books that I can't access at the moment. Our library was closed for a long time where I'm staying. I'm staying 2 hours outside of the city, away from my home during the pandemic, because I normally live in New York City, which has been a very difficult place during the pandemic. And the place where I'm staying, the library has been closed. So I have to use the Kindle, which has one advantage, which is the highlighting. So now I have highlights of any book I read that I can export and review and learn from. On a physical book, that's a little bit harder. But most of the time, I much prefer having a physical book, and I totally agree with you, Bushra. I think that's one of those values that will remain important even in the digital age. Okay, so let's talk about this ecosystem. We used to have this world of basically 5 or so categories, right, of publications and media. We had television, we had radio, we had magazines, we had newspapers. What else? What would you say I'm missing beyond those 4? If we go back pre-digital era, right? So let's say we're in the early 90s. I remember the first sort of internet news, but pre that, what else? Tabloids, okay. Pamphlets, yeah, sure. So different forms of print, tabloids, pamphlets. Well, we certainly had fiction, yes. Yep, that's an interesting approach. So you could broaden and say books, right? So long form kind of media, books on news topics or books on fictional topics that tie to the world. We have word of mouth, for sure, right? People would share news word of mouth, so that's another mechanism people use. Any others that come to mind? So by and large, that's the kind of situation we're living in, right? So we have TV, we have radio, we have magazines, we have newspapers, we have books, and then we have a couple of those other things that we've mentioned. Handouts, word of mouth, right? So that's basically the shape of the media ecosystem pre-1990, right? And if you wanted to consume something, you kind of pick one of those buckets. If you wanted to produce something, if you're a journalist, you'd say, well, I'm a magazine journalist, or I'm a newspaper journalist, or I'm a TV person or a radio person, right? Those were the kinds of structures, the paradigm, the framework that we used was basically aligned in that way. If we move into the 90s and into the 2000s, we add some things, right? We had social media, we had digital media, digital websites, etc., right? We increasingly added social media and messaging platforms like WhatsApp, WeChat, Viber, etc. But these days, the media ecosystem, I would argue, is structured very differently. And increasingly, it's structured not around the format of delivery. If you think about the category we were just talking about, they're all organized around the format, right? It's a print format, it's a visual format, it's an audio format. Increasingly, organizations are not structured along those lines, or not limited to those lines. And we're still in a transitional period, and different parts of the world are moving at different paces. There obviously are still companies that think of themselves as newspaper companies, but increasingly, that kind of scenario is starting to change. And so this is a framework that I have that I want to share with you that is the way I think about the global media ecosystem, and you can apply it on a kind of regional level or national level as well. And so there's kind of 9 players, 9 elements in this framework that I'm sharing with you, this ecosystem, right? We talked about 9 in the kind of old framework, right? TV, radio, magazines, newspapers, tabloids, books, et cetera, right? It's about word of mouth. That's about 9 in that old framework, right? So now there's 9 in this new framework, but they're structured differently. So we have international, big conglomerates, big organizations, right, that are going to increasingly become even bigger, right? We've seen that happen in any number of other industries, packaged food industries, kind of entertainment industries, right? Industrialized production industries, and that's happening in the news arena as well. We see that organizations like Schibsted and BBC in Europe and New York Times, these are kind of the international players that play on a lot of different respects, right? New York Times has multiple different video publications on Netflix, on Hulu, as well as Amazon Prime. Someone mentioned Modern Love. New York Times has a Modern Love TV show, right? Partner with Amazon for video delivery. So these are international companies, and they span across, and the New York Times has a whole podcast division. They also have a magazine. They have a whole range of different kinds of things across these different categories. Then they have books, of course, as well. The platforms are increasingly players, right? And they don't fall into the traditional categories at all, right? They're digital products of various different kinds, and they're distribution points for news, such that a growing number of people in countries around the world access their news through these platforms, first and foremost. Many of them aren't even aware of what news organization is providing the news, right? They're just aware, oh, I go to Facebook, or oh, I usually get some information on Snapchat or Twitter or whatever it is. The third big category that's growing is the venture-backed groups. So these are news organizations backed by investors who see an opportunity and who have pumped money into organizations like BuzzFeed and Vice, which were both mentioned by you all, and other organizations that are increasingly kind of growing. Vox Media is an example. ABC, Disney owns 538. That's another example. The second category are these kind of upstarts, right? So these include a lot of verticals that are focused on a niche topic. So vertical means they're basically not focused on covering news writ large. They're focused on covering something very specific. Stat covers medical issues in healthcare out of Boston, where I'm from. It's a healthcare kind of capital, right? And Stat is one of the kind of healthcare publications that focuses specifically on that arena. NK News, launched by a former student of mine, covering North Korea. So it's become the leading specialty site covering North Korea. A lot of news organizations struggle to cover North Korea, obviously, for obvious reasons. And NK News specializes in just that. Skift covers the travel industry, and they just do that. The information, as you all just mentioned, focuses on technology. So those are verticals, and that's an increasing part of the media ecosystem. Community publications are focused geographically, right? They're focused on local areas. In some cases, we have a variety of different kinds of geographic-based publications. We have local, we have regional, we have statewide or citywide, national, international. In some cases, we even have micro-local, right? Maybe some of you are familiar with micro-local publications that really just address a very, very small community, a physical community. And then we have investigative kinds of organizations. There's a myth that investigative journalism has died or is on the decline. In fact, there are more investigative and accountability organizations now than there were, 10 years ago. And they do face increasing challenges, as I mentioned, the censorship and other kinds of challenges they face. But in fact, there's a growing support for investigative and accountability journalism from philanthropists and individuals who realize that just as we need clean air and clean water, we need access to quality information. And increasingly in this 21st century, we're going to see that people around the world start to support journalism, quality journalism, in the ways that they have traditionally supported the arts and culture. So journalism is a public good, just like a lighthouse provides safety to people traveling by water, and people who are scientists who are cleaning the air and cleaning the water or measuring the air quality and water quality are providing a public good, and safe roads, etc. Those are all public goods, and information, quality information is also a public good. And those public goods, those others that I mentioned, are supported in some cases by philanthropists, by individuals who care about this, by civil society. And increasingly, civil society is going to play a role in supporting some aspects of quality journalism. It's not to say that's the only revenue model by any means, but it's going to be a part of the broader ecosystem and a part of the function of a vibrant civil society. So one thing you'll notice on this part of the framework is that we think about different kinds of niche areas, right? So we think about geographic niche, we think about demographic niche areas, so that are addressing particular groups of people by age or by gender or by other physical characteristics, right? There are news sites for cancer survivors, right? There are news sites for women over 50. There's a site that I'm aware of called Hispanic Nashville, right? It's about a particular place for a particular demographic group. And so we increasingly think about things that are divided into niche areas so they can focus really, really well on a particular group and really understand the needs and the interests and the questions and curiosities of that group. So in addition to the geographic niche areas and the demographic niche areas, we also have what we call psychographic niche areas, which are people's passions, personal and professional passions. So professional passions mean someone's willing to pay for a news site or spend time with a news site focused on commodity trading in certain African countries, or they're interested in understanding healthcare issues around a particular type of vaccine development, because that affects their professional world or is of professional interest to them. Personal passions include soccer sites, right? They include sites about knitting, or sites about swimming, or sites about any other passion that people have. And all of that is unbundled, right? All of that used to be part of the traditional TV broadcast system or a video or a magazine or newspaper, and it's unbundled into these vertical slices, right? And that's what a lot of these upstarts are focused on. And final category, so we've looked at the giants, we've looked at the upstarts. Final category of these final three areas are the challenge, what we call the challengers. And these are curators and aggregators, as well as legacy kinds of publications. So curators are those who are manually gathering information, right? I mentioned the Week magazine, that's an example. People who are manually gathering information from across different publications, across different outlets, across different countries, and presenting it for people, because people don't have the time to sort through tens of thousands of publications. So that role of curation is increasingly important in a world where there's an overflow of information and ideas and content. Aggregators do a similar task, but they do it more digitally and algorithmically. So they're essentially looking at what you've clicked on before, they're looking at what categories you've selected, and they're kind of creating an automated system to gather information for you. And a lot of those are kind of apps and other kinds of digital services. And then finally, we have the legacy publications that have been around for a long time, but are trying to reinvent themselves, trying to stay relevant in an era when their old business model, when their old approach is less relevant than it ever has been in the past. And there we have the traditional newspapers and publications and TV stations and radio stations that have kind of still clung to what they've been always tried to do and haven't quite fully adapted in many cases, although many of them are trying to. So questions on that. So that's what I think is the world we're living in. That's the new ecosystem that we're part of. That's what you're creating into, right? You're all building new ventures, new projects, coming up with new ideas. That's the kind of situation that we're working within. It's different from the old ecosystem, and it's not mapped out by the publication type. Any thoughts or questions before we move onward? Great. And somebody mentions, Babar mentions the vertical integration of education projects. Yeah, so one of the things that I see in that comment is the fact that this is a new set of revenue streams, right? So increasingly, and we'll get to this, publications and news organizations need revenue portfolios. Right? That's what a new business model includes, is a revenue portfolio. And a revenue portfolio includes multiple ways of serving the needs of actual people in the real world. Right? Not focused on what we want to do and what we historically have done, which is to sell ads and subscriptions, but to change our perspective and be user-focused. So what does the user need? So we serve these people. What do these people need? And Babar's comments to me highlights the fact that people need information to keep up with their jobs. They want to get promoted. They want to keep up with their industry. They need education. And then we can look at, well, what do we have, given what people need and what they lack and what they want and what they're spending money on and what they're willing to spend money on, right? By virtue of what they're already spending money on, right? We can look at the data. We can look at what people are doing, what their behavior is. We can understand our users well. And then we can look at the overlap. Well, what do we have? What capabilities do we have? Right? Well, it turns out we have a lot of information, right? We're business reporters. We are science reporters. We have a team of people who have excellent skill at curating and aggregating and gathering information and explaining information, right? It turns out that has a lot of the same characteristics as education. So as you point out, Babar, and again, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name, which I'm sure I am. I apologize for that. you're pointing out that Marketing Week and The Economist, they can provide that education, right? And so that's a way of creating a revenue stream that's part of a revenue portfolio. And whether you're an individual or an organization, you should adopt that same approach. There's a question again from about Flipboard and how they monetize. And organizations like that have a couple of different monetization strategies. Typically, there's some in-app advertisements. And then there's also a premium kind of upsell. We call it premium, right? So you can access it free, or you can pay for kind of a higher end version of the app without ads and with additional customization options. So that's typically the model for most of those kinds of service providers. Some of them also generate some revenue by offering basically extra distribution for certain publications. So they might take a publication that is trying to grow its audience and say, well, for this fee, we'll inject your news flow, your top article a day, into some percentage of Flipboard readers' news flow, right? So it's a kind of paid distribution methodology that can be an additional revenue stream. And then in some cases, they can sell ancillary products. You know, they can sell a custom data product, for example, to publications, telling them here's what people are most interested in and most clicking on, and provide some consultation. And say, if you want to reach readers in this age group or in this country or in this topic, here are the 10 kind of topics they've been most actively engaged with. And they can provide that kind of information and data as a service and charge either companies, and in many cases, it actually is companies, businesses, as opposed to journalism organizations. They can charge them for that information. So those are some of the ways that kind of an app like Flipboard can monetize. What have I seen that deviates from events, advertising, and subs? So lots and lots of models that deviate from that. In fact, I'm going to give you a little bit later a whole database of revenue streams with examples. And you'll see that there's lots and lots of creative approaches, and we'll get into that. So I'll save that for a little bit. But it includes everything from syndication, so providing content that others can use in other contexts, to special kind of custom publications and custom content. So media and services. Really, services is a big bucket. And again, I'll say more about this later, so I'll just be brief now. But essentially, services means you take advantage of what the news organization can do, which is produce beautiful images, beautiful video, beautiful audio, beautiful text, well-edited material. And you take advantage of that and many other things, right? Social media that's well thought out and planned and executed. All of those are needs that not only news organizations have, but businesses increasingly have. Right? If you're a bank, you have to have a content stream, right? If you're a museum, you have to have a newsletter or a podcast or a quality website. So all of these other industries need the kinds of things that journalism and journalism organizations can do. And so increasingly, in some cases, news organizations or independent journalists or entrepreneurial journalists can provide services either to individuals or to news organizations or to businesses. So I'll give you a specific example. A student of mine from Japan was working for the Asahi Shimbun, which is one of the largest newspapers in the world. As you probably know, Japan has more newspaper subscribers per capita than any other country in the world, bar none, right? The most newspaper-intensive country in the world. And the news readers are aging, and the news readers are very loyal and believe in very strongly the quality of the work of the news organization they subscribe to, right? They're very loyal readership, although it's a declining readership because it's an aging readership. And what the vision for this former student of mine, who I thought had a very perceptive idea, was that a lot of these folks who are aging want to share the story of their lives. They want to share it with their relatives, with their grandchildren. They want to have some way of documenting their life story, essentially. So they created a service, a custom service, right? It's a new revenue stream where they essentially say, we'll write your book for you. We'll tell your life story. We'll interview you, and we'll put that into a book, and that you'll have this to give to your children, your grandchildren, your colleagues, whoever you want to give it to, or it'll just be for you, right? As a statement of tribute to your life, right, and what you've done. Now they have the skill to do that. They have plenty of writers, they have plenty of editors, they have plenty of people who are great at interviewing. And guess what people are willing to pay? Someone's going to tell your life story. They're going to write a book for you. And you don't have to write, very many hundreds of those books before this is a substantial revenue stream, right? And you can have a formula. You have a template essentially that the writers can execute. So they can do X number of them per week, right? So you can see that's a viable business model. Even if you only reach a small percentage of the overall readership, which is tens of millions of people read Asahi Shimbun every day. Right? So you reach 0.1% of those with an interest in this at all, and you've got a reasonable new revenue stream. So that's just one example of a creative new approach based on the user needs, right? Based on real people and what they need in their lives and understanding the audience and understanding the audience needs and how that matches with your capability as an organization or as an individual. We all have various interests, right? We're all multifaceted humans, right? I unfortunately, I don't have a chance to get to know each of you individually, but I bet if I did, I bet if we sat down over tea or coffee and we had a conversation, we'd find there's probably 5 or 7 or 10 or 12 different things that you have a passion for in your life, right? Whether it's your family, whether it's your a variety of hobbies, what topics you're interested in, skills you have, right? We all have all of these different sides to ourselves. We're not monodimensional people. And so we do have multiple interests. And the challenge is that we want to serve people with something that's of quality and depth. And in general, if you diffuse something that you're offering in many different directions, it's hard to provide a clear value proposition, a clear message to people about what value they're going to derive from that thing, because the message is going to be clouded and distributed and fragmented in many different directions. So if I tell you that I'm going to provide you a great newsletter, and sometimes it's going to cover the arts, and sometimes it's going to cover politics, and sometimes it's going to cover business affairs, and sometimes I'm just going to have pictures, it's hard for you to understand how I'm going to do that in a quality way, in a consistent basis, and you're going to get a product that's going to seem fragmented or inconsistent. And so I think that the challenge is to prioritize something and to focus on one thing at a time, essentially. And sometimes you can do this by creating custom products that are of a limited duration. So, one of the things that you can do these days is create a product that's not an infinite product, right? It's a series. It's focused on the Olympics. Let's say the Olympics are coming up, if they happen in Japan this summer. You can create a newsletter or a podcast with 10 episodes or 10 issues about Pakistan, and I don't know how Pakistan is supposed to do in the Olympics. I don't know. I have no idea. But you could create a podcast series or a newsletter series or a niche website that would cover that just for these 3 months or whatever period it is, right? A couple months, right? If that's a passion of yours. And then in the fall, you move on to a newsletter or podcast on something else. And that might be a project for a couple of years, right? Your careers, hopefully, if you're fortunate, will have multiple phases to them, right? You'll do multiple things and you can't do them all at once, and you pick one thing and you focus on it and you do it really well and in depth and with great discipline and focus and passion. And then you find other outlets for other passions that you have. I love the violin. I was a violinist before I was a journalist, before I was an educator. And, I don't play in a professional orchestra now. I don't play professionally, but I teach a music appreciation class because it's a way for me to revel in music. I play chamber music, with my wife and friends. And you can do the same with multiple passions. You find multiple outlets, different ways of focusing your attention on things that you know about or care about. But in terms of your professional venture, I encourage you to focus and be really disciplined about focusing clearly and providing a very, very clear value proposition to the person you're aiming to reach. The nice thing is with these projects, you don't need to reach millions of people. We're not, I would strongly discourage the use of Google ads and that kind of stuff. We're not focused on reaching millions of people and making, 1 cent on each of them. We're focused on reaching a smaller group of people, but in more depth, right? You've probably heard the 1,000 true fans kind of notion, right? If you can reach 1,000 people in depth and really provide something that they care about that has impact on them, and you can really make something that matters to them, you can find ways of monetizing that. And if you're working as an individual, small group, you don't need billions of dollars or even hundreds of millions of dollars. you need a certain number of, equivalent of thousands of dollars per month, right? And you can start to piece your way to that with a very small dedicated audience. And that's not just my guess, right? That's not just my hypothesis. That's proven out by people who are doing this already, who are doing this around the world already. And we'll talk more. First point I want to make is that this isn't about technology per se. I love technology. I read a newsletter. My personal newsletter is called Wonder Tools, right? About tools and apps that are useful, help us work productively and creatively and enjoy our lives. Let me shut my camera off so you can see the rest of this thing here. And so my newsletter is about technology, but technology is not what's going to save journalism, right? We talk about these silver bullets. We talk about these amazing things that are going to change journalism and solve our problems, and it's really a myth. And it's not that these things aren't useful. It's not that I'm dismissing any of these things, right? I think virtual reality is interesting. There's some great work that's been done, and augmented reality will be increasingly useful for some people in certain contexts. I like bots. I think bots can be helpful in answering people's questions, and journalists can use bots creatively. I think TikTok is cool, and there's some nice work that people are doing creatively to reach new people. So it's not that I'm dismissive of any of these platforms individually or approaches. It's just that that's not really where our future as journalists lies in terms of solving the key core challenges we face. And if you look back at any of these things, you'll see in the end, they don't really make a huge dent in the viability or sustainability of the field or of organizations within the field. So I think we need to shift our focus from these kinds of big shiny things. I think we need incremental innovation in a variety of different areas, but essentially we need new kinds of products. We need stronger forms of journalism that reach people in creative ways and solve people's real problems and are useful to them in their everyday. So we need new products that work effectively. These are newsletters, podcasts, again, niche websites, local sites, event series, video series, those kinds of things that are useful for people. We need to rethink how we serve our community. So we need to move from one way, kind of distributing things, throwing something over the wall and hoping people read it or watch it, and instead having conversations with people, getting to know our communities well, letting them contribute, learning from them, training them, et cetera, et cetera. We need to think about the organizations that we're working in. So many of them will be independent and small and niche, one or two people, but the larger ones need to be more representative. And there's new kinds of journalism that are emerging. These are all different kind of models for thinking about journalism differently. Solutions journalism says to people, we're not just going to write about a lot of these problems and just dump them on the ground. We're going to actually think about what are people actually doing and how is that working. It's not advocacy. There's often a misperception that it's about advocacy. It's actually about looking at solutions. How are people addressing these issues? What's working, what's not? What aspects are working, what aren't? What can people do if they want to act on these issues, get involved? Dialogue journalism focuses on having people have conversations across different political perspectives. Public power asks people, right? Engages with people. What are the issues that matter to you? Right? It's not that the people determine all of the coverage, but they have a voice in it. Engagement journalism is about, again, reaching out to communities, getting to know them, understanding them, living in those communities, asking questions, participating with them, and then providing them information, ideas, data, reporting, and connecting with them after that as well. So following up on those stories, reaching back out to people, gathering people in live events, et cetera. So those are all kinds of things that people are doing to get beyond traditional approaches to journalism. It tends to fall in the more public powered in the sense that it's less about one-on-one kind of conversations. Just to clarify what I mean by public powered, what I mean by dialogue. One example of this was a conversation essentially that a news organization held. They brought people together who had family members who were killed with guns. In the U.S., the gun problem is massive epidemic basically, and they included people who had family members killed with guns, and then they also had members of the police and the NRA, National Rifle Association, people who feel strongly that gun ownership and gun rights are a basic civil right, essentially. So they brought them together, and they had really one-on-one conversations, right, with these people to really get at the issues that divide them and get them to engage and really create journalism out of that gets deeper into the issues and the challenges. So that's an example of dialogue journalism. Reddit, I think, can be powerful as a way of getting the community around a topic and really exploring what the questions they have, what the answers they have, surfacing the ideas and resources that they can gather together, and not assuming that we as a news organization have all the answers or info, but actually looking to existing communities to learn from them and to see what questions they have and then to serve their needs, right? Do we make a newsletter? Do we make a podcast? Do we make a series of different things? Do we have a website? Do we send news alerts via WhatsApp? Do we send text message updates? What's our product? What do we actually create? What's it about? How does it deliver, right? That's the first thing. Then the second bucket is the community. So who are we actually serving? How do we reach them, right? What's our distribution method? What's our engagement method? How do we learn about them? How do we serve them? How do we understand what they're reading and not reading and engage with them? How do we build that community and grow from one person reading us to 10 people to 100? So that's the second, that's the community piece, right? And then the third piece is the sustainability piece. And each of these is separate, right? You can't do one without the other, and you need all three pieces. So whether you use Reddit or whether you use, dialogue journalism as a methodology, that's a whole separate question from how you actually monetize and how you gain sustainability. Exactly. I'm going to share with you a link in a moment, which has a collection of these revenue streams and examples of them that you can click on and follow through and explore at your own leisure. So, don't try to race to write everything down. This is the link, and actually I can paste it. Oops. I can paste it into we start by taking inspiration from other projects. We don't try to reinvent the wheel and do everything from scratch. We learn from the mistakes others made, and we learn from their approaches, and we borrow, right? Borrowed creativity is an important thing. We adapt and borrow for ourselves, and we collaborate. We find people who we can work with that we can, help, that can help us with distribution, that can help us with monetization, that can help us with content production. We need partners. We need to find those who we can work with, because as independents and as small ventures, we can't do everything ourselves. So that's one thing that we need to keep in mind. Okay, so again, just to frame this in the bigger picture for a moment again, we had this era launching online. Then we had the mobile era. I remember the beginning of that mobile social era very well, because I was married the same week the first iPhone came out, which was in July, the first week in July in 2007. So this is stamped in my memory very well. And that was a different era, right? That was an era where we didn't have mobile news, we didn't have social news, and 10 years later, that's all we had practically, right? That was dominant. So now we're on a new era, right? Now we're on the third era in this realm, where we really are focused on new sustainability and new revenue streams, and that's kind of what we're focusing on now. So as I said earlier, it's all about a revenue portfolio. It's not about one revenue stream. It's not about one thing that's going to solve all the problems. It's typically about a combination of revenue streams. And these are the key revenue streams that I want to focus on. Obviously in a limited session, we don't have time to go through all of these, but this is the kind of thing that we're looking at in today's world is a bucket of different revenue streams, and not all of these works for every single project, right? It's a question of choosing a couple of things that make sense for you. And you've already heard examples of services which include kind of consulting, right? That was one of the comments from Pacific Case Study. This is a former student of mine, Noah Rosenberg, who started this project called Narratively. He was in our program a number of years ago. And it's essentially high quality long form storytelling. And he has basically a whole range of different revenue streams. Let me turn off my camera here so you can see these. And again, the point isn't to understand in depth each of these different approaches. The point is to kind of understand that there's a combination of things that are going to provide value. And if you think about the pie chart of a sustainable project, it has revenue coming from multiple different directions, so that you're protected if one doesn't work as well as you like, or one year you don't have quite as many events, for example, because the pandemic arrives. You're able to nevertheless provide some of your consulting or create an additional ebook, or you're able to ask your members to chip in a little bit extra, or you're able to create a custom content project. So one example for Narratively, they created custom content for the city of New York wanted to create some information about biking and how biking was expanding around New York City. And they don't have a content person, right? Or they may have a content person, but they don't know how to do everything themselves. So they essentially they hired out Narratively, right? The content agency arm of Narratively to create this content for them. And it wasn't a conflict of interest because Narratively is not covering, the city. It's not an accountability journalism kind of thing. So there's no conflict of interest, and the information wasn't for the readers. So it wasn't like they were polluting their website with irrelevant content. They were just providing independent content to the city in this case. They also worked for GE, General Electric. They created a video about wind power, how wind power works. And these kinds of projects are thousands and thousands of dollars. And Narratively is a very small team. It's just a couple people, but they work with a lot of freelancers from some of the best publications. So the freelancers get a big chunk of the money for creating that content. Narratively keeps some of it, and they provide value. It's a win-win-win, right? Because the readers who are reading the publication don't have to see distracting or annoying ads, and the readers get to enjoy a free publication. The company gets good content for a cheaper price than they would get if they had to pay a big marketing agency. And Narratively gets a good revenue stream that helps them do this sustainable work that they want to do. So it's a win-win-win kind of approach. Licensing, in this case, meant an educational company came to them and said, look, kids need to learn about quality writing and reading skills in school, and right now we use really boring textbook materials. Could we pay you to use your old stories in our classroom materials? They said, sure, why not? Right? That's a great opportunity. It's additional revenue. They don't have to write the stories again. They just have to provide them to this company, and that turned out to be a really great revenue stream for them. They also ran a Kickstarter campaign at the very beginning, which generated revenue from the community, which was a form of early membership. And then they moved on to Patreon, which is another membership kind of a platform later on. So that's an example. And more broadly, these are kinds of revenue streams that apply in a lot of different kinds of businesses, and each of them has its own challenge, right? So there's no free lunch, as we say, right? Each thing you do, it's not like this is just a magic wand and you wave it. It's complicated, right? Entrepreneurship in any field is complicated. If you want to start a startup of any kind, social network, a photo site, a laundromat, a restaurant, any kind of entrepreneurship is challenging. Most people fail. The majority of people who start something fail. So it's not that journalism is somehow, unusually challenging. Everything in entrepreneurship is challenging, and you just have to identify what the challenges are specific to the thing that you're trying to do, and you have to kind of work to address that. And you have to pick the ones that where you're best suited and your capabilities are best suited to enable success. So I won't go through this in depth. If you have questions on any of these specific things, we can come back to them, or we can follow up on any of them. But suffice it to say that the key challenge for you as an individual or an organization is to identify those three key things that I referenced earlier. One is, what is the product that we are creating, or products plural that we are creating, that really meets the needs of people that we're serving, and how can we best do that? Should we have a newsletter that provides this product? Should we have a podcast? What should the tone be, the length be, the frequency be, the style be? How are we framing the topic? The product is the core thing, right? And then how do we actually reach people? How do we make them know this exists, right? How do we market this? How do we engage people? How do we understand what they actually need? And then how do we provide the product to them, distribute it, follow up with them, grow the audience, empower them to share it with people, right? That community piece. Then the third piece is this revenue piece. So looking at this bucket of potential opportunities, which of these makes sense? What's an experiment we can run on any of these to test whether or not this might work? And a lot of people think it's about writing a business plan, and that's a common misconception. People spend 6 months and write an elaborate plan, or write a 5-year plan. That's like if to use a soccer or cricket analogy, or football, as I guess you call it. If you were to go and design put all your players in the locker room and design your strategy for a year, right? And sit around in the locker room and decide what plays you're going to do, who's going to kick to who, or which batter is going to hit what ball, etc. You can't do that, right? You have to actually encounter the matches and improve in the matches and go in the real world and play and see what happens and adapt to that. And so it's not about creating these elaborate, complicated business plan that you spend a year on. It's about creating a hypothesis and a model for how this might work and what problem you're solving, and then testing the hypothesis with real people as quickly as possible, and then learning from it and adapting and iterating. That's what modern entrepreneurship is, and that's what entrepreneurial journalism is. Okay, so pays for news. This again, I'm not going to go into this in great depth. It's just a picture of how this is changing. And unfortunately, Pakistan is not in this data set. This is from Reuters Digital News Report 2020, which you may have seen. And Pakistan is not in this data set, but it gives you a sense of various places around the world. And you have what you have is the story of growth. These numbers were all lower 5 years ago than they are now, and they will be higher 5 years from now than they are today, right? At different rates, depending on different cultural factors, et cetera. But this is changing, it's growing, it's still, relatively low, right? The percentage of people who pay for news is still, far smaller than the percentage who don't. But it's growing. And there are places where it's really beginning to be a substantial part of the digital news ecosystem. You see here on the left an example from Germany. This is just to give you a sense of who it is within the population that's paying. And this is, as I said, just a case study in the case of Germany, and just to give you a sense of the fact that one major takeaway I would offer is that this kind of trend line, right? The people who are younger are more likely to pay than the people who are older, right? And that holds true in many countries. I don't know if it holds true in Pakistan or not, but it holds true in many countries. And it's evidence that there's growth potential for growth. This is a subset of countries, and it's just, again, looking at the trend line, and the Scandinavian countries obviously are kind of a little bit unusual outliers in this regard. But again, the trend line tends to be upwards in a lot of countries. Trust is still a problem. This is pulled out data from Italy just as an example. Trust is still problematic. And this actually is an area where individual journalists or smaller groups that take a fresh approach and that really listen to people, they can somehow have an advantage because the larger organizations are facing declining trust. Yes, Sarah's question about disinformation during the pandemic. Yeah, people value in-depth reporting. Absolutely, it's really, it became clear for many people during the pandemic that this was not just an abstract issue, right? They wanted to know whether their children would be able to go to school, whether their parents would be able to survive, whether they were going to be able to retain their jobs. I mean, their very livelihoods were dependent on information, and they were really at the mercy of the news that was available to them. So I do think that that's an important area in which the pandemic in some ways solidified the importance for people of quality news. One thing, this is a note, this is data point from Germany. One thing to note here is that, at the moment, people still tend to rely heavily on one or two kind of outlets, right? So in this case, if you look at the data here, it's basically saying that 90% of people in Germany, if they subscribe to something, they only subscribe to one or two things. So it's kind of a winner-take-all situation in some cases, where people don't have 5 or 10 different digital subscriptions, right? They have one or two. And that means that there's more competition for their limited digital dollars. But that, again, is changing. In the video realm, in the audio realm, people increasingly have subscriptions not just to Spotify, but also to Netflix, or not just to Netflix, also to Disney Plus or Hulu or whatever it is. So this kind of behavior is gradually changing. We're still competing with these other players, right? People are still thinking about their buckets of money. Am I going to spend money on a subscription to a news service, or am I going to spend money on a subscription to Spotify or Netflix or something else, right? So we're living in kind of a competitive world, but if we're talking about business dollars, right? The example we heard of the company earlier, right? That's an example where people are spending business dollars, and that's a different story. Okay, yeah, and somebody mentioned education, so I wanted to pull this up. Education is an example. Someone mentioned The Economist and Marketing Week as providing education training. And so I wanted to share this example, which illustrates that in Latin America, this is an increasingly common revenue stream. So this is from Sembra Media, which studies media in Latin America. And that illustrates the fact that there's a growth in that kind of revenue. So that's a valuable area Somebody mentioned the funnel also. For those of you who aren't familiar with that kind of terminology or haven't thought it through, this is really core to what we do. So without getting into detail about this is a graphic from Harkin. Don't have to worry about that particular platform. The point is that people in general are coming through news products like consumers of any other product, and we have to think about how do we bring them back a second time, and how do we engage them on a regular basis. And that's the value of a newsletter, by the way, or podcast. For the New York Times and the Washington Post, which both have more than 50 newsletters, and now have many podcasts. I don't know what the number is up to for the New York Times. It's several that they're up to now. And the function of that is not generally to make profit first and foremost. It's to bring people back and re-engage them. So people who are subscribers to a newsletter for major news organizations, the data shows that their propensity to become a paid subscriber is 50% higher than those who are not subscribers to a newsletter or podcast of that organization. So what that means is it builds loyalty, builds engagement, and increases the likelihood of someone becoming a member or a subscriber. And that's part of this funnel kind of thinking. So it's important to think about that funnel process. And this is true all over the world. So these are 3 examples from 3 different countries. This is, I'm going to move myself out of the way here. El Diario is a great story from Spain. I don't know if people are familiar with it. They started just 7 years ago, right? Not too long ago. We can all probably remember what we were doing 7 years ago. 7 years ago, they were just a group of people who said, what if we created a quality news product that's digital, right? And probably 7 years from now, if I were to encounter one of you, you'll say, oh, 7 years ago, I had this thing I was working on, and look what we've built now, right? We've built it up, and we've built this really sustainable, exciting venture. So that's what they did 7 years ago, and they now have 103 staff members, right? They had 8 people. They now have 6.6 million in revenue in euros, and they're one of the top 4 outlets in Spain right now. And it's through membership, right? They said to people, we are going to provide this quality news. We need you to be part of this. We want you to be part of this. We want to serve you. Join us, right? If you care about your country, you care about quality education and healthcare, you care about the system that you're living in, and people responded to that. And Tortoise is doing that in the UK. 6 a.m. is doing that through a variety of platforms in the US and in the southwest of the US. Subscription, people think of it as kind of synonymous with membership. I just want to clarify that that's a transaction, right? You're saying to people, we promise you this, and you're transacting with us, right? But a membership is a very different kind of thing, right? And that's what El Diario is focused on, and many other news organizations. It's kind of the new way of thinking about things. Is we want to build a relationship with you. We want you to be part of this. This is what museums have long done. It's what ballets have done. Symphonies have done. It's not about a transaction. You're paying for one thing and getting that thing. It's about being part of a community, being part of an organization. The Guardian has done this phenomenally well, right? Million members. And in the Guardian's case in the UK, they don't say you get anything different. You don't get anything different. So you can get everything you can for the Guardian for free, or you can make a statement and say, I care about this. I want to be part of this. I want to make news available to other people. And they've done it tremendously well. And then there's also a donation and a charitable model, right? Which is to say, we need this. We don't want to sugarcoat this. We're doing work that's of value to civic society, and we want you to support that. And it can be either individuals or organizations, right? So grant-making organizations support quality environmental research. They support healthcare research. They should also support, journalistic. Okay, do you see what I'm looking at now? This is the database, revenue database. You'll see there's a table of contents, all these different revenue streams, right? And here are the sources, by the way. If you want to go back to the original sources, these are from all of these different pieces that have addressed what are the different revenue streams, right? So you can go back to the original sources. There's a database here, an Airtable database that I put in, which has a different view. But let's just go into one of these in particular. So if we go into events, and I'm hoping you're still seeing this, right? If you're not, let me know, because I can't see both windows at once. These are all examples of specific kinds of event series that and this set is heavily US focused, but there's some in some other folks, and over time I'm going to add examples from around the world, but I wanted to just start with a small number. And you can sort of just take a look at what they're actually doing and how it works, and how they present it, what their different kinds of events. GeekWire, by the way, does not just an award ceremony, they also have a ping pong tournament, right? Because they're aimed at techies and technology professionals, and they found that was something they were really excited about. So they created an event that's a ping pong tournament, a table tennis tournament, because that was a hobby of a lot of people in the industry they're serving in Seattle. So, and you can go through any of these different tabs and explore different kinds of services. And if you click on these links, you'll see some examples. And then in here, there's also some more detail about some of these examples. So I hope that's useful context for you. Any questions on that resource? You can explore that further on your own if that's relevant and interesting for you. Which is made, by the way, with Coda, which I really recommend if you're on Google Docs or Microsoft Word or some other old system. Coda is a nice way of integrating all sorts of visuals, and you can embed materials in it. You can create basically websites very easily as you would a document. It's kind of the next generation of digital editing tools, along with Notion. Move forward onto some additional kind of examples of these creators. And so we have this new era, this post-COVID creator era, right? That's really emerging, and that's really where you're going to be thriving, hopefully, in the months and years to come. And it's really about the rise of these independents, the rise of these organizations like the ones you're creating. And when I say independence, it could be one person, but it could also be a small group or a small organization. The 19th is a great example. It's women-led, for women, by women. They've already done a lot of really great work in the past year. And they were the first to interview Kamala Harris, for example, our new vice president, and they are really doing strong work and already kind of building sustainability, a strong team, and addressing an underserved niche. They're doing great work. The Markup is another example in the technology realm. So for too long, technology reporting was about the shiny new Android device or Apple phone or whatever, and they're basically looking at these algorithms that are determining, who gets healthcare and who doesn't, or who gets parole out of prison and who doesn't, and what challenges those algorithms are facing. They also create other products. So back to the point about products and services, news organizations aren't just creating websites and articles, right? They need to create products and services as well. So they created a free privacy inspector for websites. You can poke in any website in there. And it builds loyalty, it builds engagement, it creates value for people who are reading and consuming the site, and it helps them do their mission, which is to educate people about, internet privacy and kind of spying behavior that happens online. The information was mentioned earlier, has thrived despite the ton of free technology information that's already out there, coverage, right? There's tons of free websites that already cover this industry, and yet they can charge $400. It's because they do it really well and in depth. And in this case, it's not really bells and whistles, right? It's pretty straightforward. They do invite people to be part of editorial meetings and stuff, like to hear what they're talking about, but basically it's just content. So the point I want to make on this one is that, sometimes there's new technology you can use, and use newsletters and podcasts and video series and event series and do kind of new things. But sometimes you can just drill in a topic that wasn't adequately addressed. This is a new approach to local site called Lookout, and they're starting with readers getting to know the community before just jumping in and putting articles out there. I mentioned NK News, North Korea. How India Lives is a great project from a former student of mine, John Raja, who basically looked at the fact that data from across India's 30+ states was inadequately available to people, right, in all different formats. So he basically created unified data sets that were made available to people across India, and actionable, and he provided to businesses as well as journalism organizations, and has made that into a sustainable business. Newsletters to me are a very exciting frontier. I think this is a huge arena. Substack is a platform that's exploded this year. They have all kinds of writers writing on all kinds of topics. But Substack is just one platform, right? The platform isn't the main point. It's the distribution mechanism that people get email. Email is the one thing that's cross-platform, cross-system, cross any kind of device, any kind of country, any kind of technological system. It's not owned by anyone. And there are challenges, obviously, different email readers, respond to newsletters differently, et cetera. But it's a uniform delivery system that is very powerful. And in the workflow of the modern worker, it's the one place most workers in most countries that are working with information, they're going to their email every day. And by the way, texting also is a very valuable mechanism, I think. There's a company called Subtext, which is joinsubtext.com, and there's another one I just saw this week called Llama Text, with 2 L's, and they are both providing people a way to deliver news and information by text message, which I think is an interesting new arena in the coming years. And obviously there are WhatsApp groups and many other kinds of distribution mechanisms, but I think it's worth exploring these new kinds of systems that move beyond a website. For independent, Substack is great too, because you can do whatever you want with it, right? You own your own email list. You own the relationship with the customer. So you can, if you decide you want to move to another platform, you can, right? If you're on Facebook, for example, that's not the case, right? If you're on Twitter and you want to move your followers, you can't just do that, right? But on Substack, you essentially get your email list. You get the payment is through Stripe, which you can port to any other service. And you get all this stuff for free, actually, on Substack, right? So their monetization is to take 10% if you start charging. So I chose Substack, and largely because I was doing it as a side project and it was free, and I haven't paid them a dime, right? And I've grown the list, and I don't pay it at all. And if I were delivering on MailChimp or some other service for my newsletter, it would cost in excess, I think, of between 100 200 a month, right, to deliver that, which is not, it's significant. So Substack is great in that respect. And there are other platforms like that, right, that are emerging. Review is another platform that Twitter just bought, which removed its pricing, and that's a great platform for curation, and you can do it for free. And when you charge, then they'll take a percentage, which I believe is only 5%, which is quite reasonable. We don't have time to get into this in depth at the moment, but the point is you have a direct relationship, right? Newsletters are disrupting newspapers and other kinds of print media, in that they provide a direct relationship with you, the creator, to your reader. And that's very powerful, right? You don't have to be at the whim of your organization. You can actually reach people directly. And as I said earlier, you don't need millions of people. You don't even need many thousands, right? If you have 1,000 subscribers and they're paying you $5 a month, right? $5 US or €5 or the equivalent of that in your currency, that's already starts to be a sustainable living, right? And then it goes upwards from there as you build over time, and you add other revenue streams. Across Substack, 500,000 people are already paying now. And examples of these that have succeeded: Platformer is one. Let me take off my camera again. He's covering technology, and basically said to people, "Hey, I'm going to do this thing, and you can pay, $10 a month or $100 for the year." And this was of interest to enough subscribers that they were willing to pay. Right? Again, you don't need everyone to pay; you just need a small percentage that can pay. And this is what he does. Right? This is Casey Newton. And I'm not saying everyone can do this. Everyone has different size audience, different type of audience. This is Emily Atkin. Somebody mentioned the environment earlier in the comments. So she writes about her plumbing breaking. She writes about her own career. She has a personal kind of tone, and she writes about these ridiculous lawmakers who oppose, progress on environmental issues, and she has 2,500 people who decided they'll pay her, and that's more than enough to sustain her, right, in a nice salary, even after the 10% goes to Substack and 3% goes for Stripe's payment. This is another one I like a lot, Judd Legum. He does a lot of great journalism work, and he's doing as important work as anyone at any of the major news organizations, but he's doing it independently. And this, just to give you a sense of how this works, right? He has a large number of subscribers because he's done really good work over a long number of years now. And about 5%, between 5% and 10% pay, and the mathematics of it, right, work out quite nicely. Again, I'm not suggesting that this is something that will magically work for everyone. I'm just suggesting that this is now a viable, feasible approach that works for many and growing number of independent journalists. And not all of them are making 300,000K, obviously. Many of them are making 50 or 40 or 70 or, in some cases 30 the first year, whatever it is, right? And they're starting out. This is Nathan. He's 28 years old. He didn't even finish college, but he knows a lot about finance. He started a thing about the monetary problems during the crisis, the pandemic. He's got people interested. He was covered by Bloomberg, and now basically has this full-time career. Hired someone to help him, and this has actually updated since then. And I think he's making close to specialist at this point. And it's not just about journalists, right? This is people who have expertise can do this whether they're kind of formally journalists or not. Right? This is one thing that journalists assume, that they have the sole control of kind of media and information, but actually anyone who's has intelligence can become a newsletter writer, right? So we're not going to be just competing with other journalists. We're going to be competing with experts in all different realms. And that's an important thing for us to be aware of. Okay, I think I'm going to kind of stop there. There's obviously a lot more in this topic, a lot more examples of people who are doing this in a lot of different realms. I've shared the slides with you all, so you'll have those in your learning management system. You can explore them, and you can feel free to follow up with me if you have questions on something in particular, if I can be helpful on something in particular. And if you're interested in my own newsletter, that's the link, but it's not really related to this topic. It's related to the tools stuff that I'm interested in. So that's my personal kind of side project. But if you want to get a sense of what an individual Substack is like, that's what that is. And podcasts are another area where there's huge growth, right? All sorts of new platforms. You can create a free podcast that's distributed around the world with Anchor, completely free. So these platforms oftentimes have no barriers, right? You don't need any cost. You don't need any skill. You can create a podcast today in about an hour. And you can even add membership now with these other platforms like Supercast and Glow. So more than ever, and this is Carlos Mazza who does this. He left Vox to do his own YouTube kind of thing, so it can be done in video. He uses Patreon. So you can see at the bottom, he has more than 1,000 patrons who give him $2, $5, or $10 a month to support his work. And if you do the math, it's a starting point. He's not done growing, but he's got a good start. And there's many others. And doing this, having your own independent thing is really a protection for you in a market that's really challenging. 11,000 U.S. journalists lost their jobs last year. So this is protection in a world where there's less stability. And it's also meaningful. You can focus on what you really care about. You can get stronger at writing, you can get stronger at editing and video, at audio, whatever your kind of realm is. You can really, because you are really in charge. And you can have impact on the things that you care about. You do need loyalty from people, right? You can build that loyalty by really serving people with value. And ultimately, if you can find those 1,000 true fans that you can really serve well, you can make this a viable and sustainable and successful livelihood for yourselves. So that's what I wish for you, and I hope that you have great success in doing that. So yeah, language is an interesting thing because it can be useful to use in your advantage in the sense that if you can reach people in a language that there isn't a lot of great content available in, you can have a great barrier that protects you from competition from others, right? So there might be 1 million sites, 1,000 sites about some particular topic in business and technology and sports and health and science, whatever it is, politics, news, that are available to people. But if they're not available in the language that people want to read it in, you can really capitalize on that. And that can be a distinction that you have. So one of the things that I think is crucial is to think about your capabilities and the strengths that you have. We talked about these kind of core areas, right? These sort of product, the community, and the sustainability, right? We talked about those today. But the other thing, and we also talked, by the way, about starting with a very specific experiment, right? Learning from real users and focusing on real pain points. So if a pain point is language, right, that people can't access information, or they they don't enjoy it, or they prefer to do it in a different language, that's a great way to reach people, and that's a great way to create a distinction. And so what I want to emphasize here is, you know, you want to think about what your particular strengths are, what you do that's really effective and distinct, and what you can do, what your skills are, right? You can think about this as your hands, your heart, your head, right, and your connections, right? So your skills, let me get that out of the way there. Okay, so your skills are what you can do. You can write in multiple languages, or in a local language, or in a specific language. That's a distinction, right? That allows you to then do something that others can't do, and that leads to a value proposition that's unique to you. And ultimately, that's what you want, right? You want to create the same product that lots of other people have. You want to create a distinct and unique value prop. And your knowledge of a particular region or particular topic, right, is also something that's a distinction. So when you think about identifying ways of serving people successfully and creating successful products and services, you want to think about what the needs are of people out there, but then you also want to think about your internal capabilities. So what you can do, that's your hands, what you know, that's your head, what drives you, where your passion is, that's your heart, right? Those are the things you want to think about in terms of matching your capabilities to the needs, and who you know is the network, because you need people that you can align with and work with as part of your venture, because nobody can do everything as a single superhuman. Yeah, so building an Urdu language, that can be a great approach if that solves a need, right? If there are people out there that are looking for that, if you have a unique offering that's not, you know, well served in the marketplace, and you have a clear way of describing that, you know, one thing that's important is being able to encapsulate what your value is. But your value prop has to very, very concisely and effectively summarize for people what you're doing. So I'm going to give you an example of that. Let's see if I can paste this in here. Yeah, so here's a little template. So our such and such, all right, our Urdu news service helps, you know, seniors in this particular region, or, you know, young professionals in this particular region who want to, you know, move ahead in the professional services industry X, right, by providing them updated information about whatever, because like to reduce the challenge they face in finding relevant information in this arena, and by helping them, you know, achieve professional